just between the years of 14 and 20 in my own life. I was abandoned by my father when he walked out on our family. I was sexually abused at school on my 15th birthday during the lunch hour. I moved 4 times. I went from living very comfortably to living in terrible poverty. I was married, and I was married during those years too, to a guy who was going to walk out on me just a few years later. Come on in. Welcome, welcome. Glad you're here. We got some room up here at the front. Are you Rachel?
Yes.
Nice to meet you, Rachel. So it was, those 6 years of my life were rough, to say the least. Being young certainly spares us no difficulties in our life. The drama and trauma we often experience in these years is no joke. Stress at school, stress at home, stress in our relationships. It isn't easy. And tonight I want to tell you a story of another teenager, a teenager in the Bible. Joseph was a kid, in some respects, who lived a charmed life, at least at first glance. Joseph was born in Haran to parents Jacob and Rachel. A little backstory is needed in order to fully understand Joseph's early life. In the book of Genesis, we get to follow 4 generations of one family. They're often called the patriarchs: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Abraham and his son lived in Canaan, and Canaan is what we know now as the country Israel. Isaac had twin boys, Esau and Jacob, and one day they had a falling out because Jacob, the younger brother, tricked his older brother into giving over his birthright to him, and that was a very big deal back then. In essence, what Esau did was sign over his entire inheritance to his younger brother. When Esau realized the mistake he made, he wanted to kill his brother. And so Jacob fled to Haran, where the family was from, where his uncle Laban was living. Once he was there, Jacob worked for his uncle in exchange for the hand of his beautiful but younger daughter Rachel, whom he loved very much. But on their wedding night, Rachel pulled a fast one on Jacob and substituted the older sister Leah. Quite a surprise to Jacob. Laban eventually let Jacob marry Rachel, but all of this set up very negative dynamics for Joseph, and Joseph hasn't even been born yet. But Joseph is going to be born into a very difficult, tense family situation. So hopefully you read this in your homework this week. I'm not going to go into all the detail. If you haven't had a chance, you can go back and pick that up this week. But here's a quick rundown of how this crazy family was formed. So Leah, the unloved wife, had 4 boys right off the bat after she married Jacob. Then Rachel found out she couldn't have children. And so Rachel gave her servant to Jacob as a wife, and that servant had 2 more boys. Well, Leah decided to play the same game. She gave her servant to Jacob to be a wife, and, 2 more boys. Then Leah started having kids again on her own. Theme here, right? 2 more boys. And finally, after a while, a girl was born to the family, to Leah, that first daughter, Dinah. Long after those 10 boys were born, lo and behold, Rachel got pregnant. And that was a big surprise. And she got pregnant with Jacob's 11th son, Joseph. Back in biblical days, it was normal for a man to have more than one wife. We don't do that in this society, but I want you to think for a moment what it might have been like to live in that family system. Even though we don't have multiple wives in this country, well, not typically, but suffice it to say, it does not make marriage easier, it makes marriage much harder. Not only are there struggles between your mother and your father, there's struggles between dad and his 3 other wives. And then there's struggles between the 4 wives, particularly jealousy. It's pretty messy. It's not an easy situation, very stressful. Some of you, however, are being raised in some similar dynamics, as I was, and you have half-siblings, or you have step-siblings. I had both. If you do, then you know just how complicated families can get sometimes. Between just my mother and father, there were 8 marriages. I knew nothing of marital stability when I became an adult. I had a half-brother and I had 5 step-siblings and 2 full siblings. So Joseph is born. Jacob holds nothing back, doting on this long-awaited child, born to his favorite wife. Joseph is the special one, getting all the goodies from Dad. For the 10 brothers, it was always Joseph who was thrown into their faces. Why can't you be more like Joseph? You don't see Joseph getting in trouble like that, do you? Not easy for anyone. Not easy for those brothers, especially not easy for Joseph. He was hated by his brothers, who resented his very existence. After all, everything was fine until Joseph was born. So Joseph grows up in Haran with mom and dad, 3 stepmothers, a half-sister, and 10 half-brothers. These earliest years were probably pretty good for Joseph. His family was still living with his grandpa Laban, who had wives and children of his own, as you read in the story this week. So Joseph grew up with aunts and uncles and cousins and grandparents. It was probably a great life for a little boy, on a ranch, living with lots of relatives, and this was all he knew the first 6 years of his life. As idyllic as ranch life was, though, the relationship between his grandpa Laban and his father Jacob was not a good one. It was strained, to say the least. It turned out that Jacob had a pretty good talent raising the herds of sheep and goats. But Laban was selfish, and he did not want to share his wealth with Jacob, even if he was married to his daughters. So he cheated Jacob out of his wages many times. Finally, one night, Jacob's had enough, and he packs up his family, and they flee in the middle of the night. And again, I want you to imagine being in this family. Imagine being about a first grader, and your mom comes in one night, and she just shakes your shoulder and says, "Honey, get up. Put your things in a bag. We're leaving." And you're just gone. And you don't get to see those relatives again. And you don't get to see that home again. And you don't really know what's going on. I mean, this was a very abrupt change in Joseph's life. He had no warning. And this would become a repeated theme for him. All of a sudden, things would just shift suddenly without warning. So Joseph and his siblings hit the road along with the rest of their family and their herds, and they head back to the land where Jacob's family is living, back to Canaan. And it's unlikely he ever saw those relatives again, because it's not like there were airplanes and buses and cars. There was no social media or Skype or telephones or anything, so that was probably the end of that. And this was Joseph's first major loss in his life, breaking his young heart. Likely, he had some hefty fear at this point. He's just a little boy. He doesn't know what's happening. He doesn't know where they're going. They're on the run from his grandpa. Why on earth do they have to run from his grandpa? Not easy for a little boy. So the next event we hear of in Joseph's life happens when he's around 13 years old, and Dinah, his sister, is raped by the local prince. So Simeon and Levi, older brothers, decide to get revenge by murdering every man in the city. This is not good on many levels. Not only is it really bad behavior to murder a bunch of people, but afterward it also meant the family was on the run again. They had to hit the road again. It was only a matter of time before the people in the neighboring towns found out what this family had done and came after them. So they had to go again. They packed their tents and left the area. So this was difficult from many angles, but I think one of the hardest things probably for Joseph was much more personal for him. So given the birth order, Dinah was probably the closest in age to Joseph. And she would not have posed the threat that Joseph did to the older brothers, because she was a girl. It would have been different. And it's very likely they grew up playmates and were close. This sexual abuse would have dramatically changed Joseph's sister. He would likely have had strong feelings of injustice and fear and rage and confusion about why his sister was treated this way. This is tough stuff for Dinah and for her brother Joseph, both of them. But that wasn't the only crisis for Joseph that year. While they were running away from Shechem, the town where the murders occurred, it came time for Rachel to give birth. So it had been 13 years since Joseph was born, and suddenly Rachel got pregnant again. To Benjamin, Joseph's only full sibling. And while they're on the road traveling, Rachel gives birth. But just minutes after she does, Rachel dies. This would have been Joseph's biggest loss to date. The unimaginable grief at losing his mother would change his world forever. The sadness, the grief, the loneliness that Joseph would have gone through. With Rachel gone, the family dynamics changed again. Until then, Rachel was always there, keeping an eye out for Joseph, stepping in if those older brothers got out of line. But now that she was gone, Joseph was much more vulnerable in this family. They could be more open about their hostility toward their younger brother than ever. It was a whole new game. Now he only had one person on his side, Dad, and it was very likely Dad wasn't as attentive as Mom. He had 3 other families. He had a big business to run. And all this sets the stage for the event that will forever define Joseph's life. It's the event I call the Big Kahuna, and this time Joseph is going to lose everything except his life. Before we get into the scripture, I want you to see something here. Everyone in this family system, is being victimized by Jacob's parenting choices. Jacob's parenting skills are horrendous. He's a good man, truly a good man, but his parenting skills need some work. When he chooses to favor Joseph over the 10 older brothers, he leaves them with deep wounds of rejection and abandonment. There is nothing worse than fearing you don't have your mother's love or your father's love. The boys were angry, and rightly so, and they directed their anger right at Joseph. It wasn't Joseph's fault, though. He was the scapegoat. It was Jacob who created those wounds of rejection, not Joseph. That was not his fault. But it was easier to be mad at their brother than their father. If they directed their anger at their father, they risked even further rejection from him. And that was an unacceptable risk. And Joseph, as I said, he's being victimized here as well by Jacob's parenting choices because it results in him being hated by all of his older brothers. So let's take a break here, and you have a place on your outline to write down some thoughts.